Let's go through orderliness. So you can decide whether you're orderly or disorderly. Leave your belongings around. That you're disorderly, obviously, if you do that. Like order, well, that's a no-brainer. Keep things tidy. Follow a schedule. Is bothered by messy people. Wants everything to be just right. Is bothered by disorder. Likes routine. Sees that rules are observed, and wants every detail taken care of. You can imagine all sorts of occupations where that would be useful. Accounting, for example, or there are people who go around and check, natural gas fittings and that sort of thing by a checklist. And you want someone like that in any position where careful attention to detail is absolutely vital. The question is, as we said before, what's the potential downside? So let's take a look at orderliness, because we don't have much to say about industriousness, because we don't know anything about industriousness, but we're starting to understand a lot about orderliness, and it's extremely interesting. So we'd only managed to parse out orderliness, roughly speaking, only managed to parse out conscientiousness into orderliness and industriousness over about the last 10 years. I mean, people had placed orderliness under conscientiousness before that, but psychometrically, it's become, with the Big 5 aspect scale, it's become more straightforward to measure. And so here's what we know about orderliness so far. It predicts conservatism along with low openness. Low openness is a better predictor of conservatism and high openness of liberalism than conscientiousness is. But conscientiousness is a pretty good predictor, and that's almost all orderliness. It's also associated with disgust sensitivity. Now, that's a very cool thing. So Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of work on disgust sensitivity, and so has a guy named Paul Rosen. And I knew their research from really almost 30 years ago now, and I thought they were really onto something back in the 90s. I really thought that investigating disgust would be useful because no one had ever really talked about it, hadn't conceptualized it as a separate emotion system. And you can't let the orderliness part of you get the upper hand so terribly that it's impossible for you to live. That's what happens to girls who have anorexia, by the way. You know how there's this idea with regards to anorexia that it's often high achieving girls who have it. Well, it's hyper-conscientious girls. They get so disgust sensitive they can't stand their own bodies. And so, for example, then they stop being able to look at their bodies properly. And so what they do, instead of looking at their whole body, they lose the ability to do that. They only can see parts of their body, and then they can't tell the difference between a part that's healthy and well-shaped and a fat part. And so anything that's what would you call, of dubious, anything that's hard to measure becomes impossible to see. So I had an anorexic client at one point. She wasn't a very big woman, maybe about this big and thin, yes, obviously. And so I was trying to work with her on her body perception disorder, and one of the things I did was, so I had her come and sit beside me. So I was sitting like this, and so was she, and I said, well, you look at our two thighs, which one is bigger? And like mine was like 40% bigger. And she said, well, I can't tell, they look the same to me. And so I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I let her do it. I said, you take a pencil, and I'll sit on a piece of paper, and you just trace my thigh, okay? And then you can put that piece of paper underneath your thigh and trace it, and then you can look at the difference. Well, so I had her do that, and she looked at the two pieces of paper, and she couldn't believe it. She could not believe that that was actually the case, because her perception had become so disordered that it was impossible for her to see the real shape of her body. And we would go outside, and I would ask her, is that person thin? Is that person fat? And with other people, she could tell, but with her own body, not a chance. She couldn't see it properly at all. And so there's a real obsession with purity among women who have anorexia. They'd like to starve themselves right down to the bone, because the bone is sort of pure and white and there's no excess tissue on it. And so anorexia also looks like a disease of disgust. And so it's very, very difficult to... She thought in very black and white terms. One of the things I had her do at one point was, she has a music, she said, I either really like a song or I don't like it at all. And I said, okay, well, you've got a music collection. Why don't you go through like 20 of those songs and rate them on a scale from 1 to 10? And she couldn't do it. It was either yes or no, orderly, right? The boundaries around the categories were absolutely segregated, and her apartment tended to be decorated in black and white, and she was hyper clean, so everything in the apartment was extraordinarily orderly, well put away. She couldn't stand to see anything disgusting on the counters and that sort of thing. So she was also extraordinarily judgmental and perfectionistic, but that goes along with it because orderly people are judgmental and perfectionistic. And so if you're a perfectionist, often what that means is you have very high levels of orderliness and very high levels of neuroticism. neuroticism. And those two things chase each other around like mad because you can't stand the idea that you would make a mistake, and you get anxious about it as well. So then you get stuck in this perfectionistic mindset and you can't get out of it.